Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lee and Lacey.
Hey.
Hello.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, you can support us on Patreon and give us a rating and review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to talk about Death by Pitchfork. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Stargate Pioneer,
I'm Haley. And I'm Lauren from Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D.
a podcast member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the one you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other podcasts
At GonnaGeekNetwork.com. And get ready because geekiness begins in 3,
2.
1.
Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. So as you heard, we are going to talk about Death by Pitchfork.
Every time you say Pitchfork, I think about the painting with the old guy and farmer
the farmer.
lady.
American Gothic.
Yeah, that's the one.
If you're not familiar with the term Death by Pitchfork, it's basically a reference to Frankenstein in that he's this giant, strong, indestructible monster, and then the mob comes to get him.
I just pictured a bunch of Italian guys.
No.
The mob. Somebody needs to write that story.
Right. He sleeps with the fishes. He's already dead. What do you do? Okay, so but
Concrete boots. Still not slowing him down.
Right.
What?
So basically, but the mass of peasants, how's that? They comes to get
That's
him
much better.
with torches and pitchforks to kill him, right? So I don't know if it's everywhere in every vampire game or in every Mind's Eye Theater game, but it's a term that we had that was using the mortals and influence and allies and contacts and stuff to send hordes of weak, mortals against someone that are essentially disposable and easy to kill by themselves. But when there's a horde of them, it's kind of hard to fight against that, right?
Yeah, it's the Yertle the turtle argument.
Exactly, to borrow from Dr. Seuss. I believe that might be the first time that Dr. Seuss was referenced in a Vampire the Masquerade setting. But
I hope to make many more. Challenge accepted.
Right on. So this is going to kind of cross a couple different things. We're going to focus, I think, mainly on in the Vampire the Masquerade world, but I think all these concepts are easily applicable to any kind of game you're involved in. If that's like a spy game where you're doing like a Jason Bourne style thing and you can manipulate organizations and this kind of thing, or if it's in a D&D game and you're some kind of influential person, a ruler, and you have hordes of people to send against someone, or it could work in any genre or any style of game. But I think, at least personally for me, the most experience I have with it, and I think with the rest of you as well, is in the vampire world, right? Would you agree with that or no?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think so.
Okay.
Except for the time I got marauded by a bunch of first level wizards. Magic missile never misses.
That's hilarious. Like 20 first level wizards. They all shoot their bottle rocket off once and then run away. That's a great way to discourage somebody from doing something silly. That's awesome. Wait, who did that?
I think Carrie did it against Brian.
Oh, that's hilarious. Right on. Okay. The horde of wizards has a 17 on initiative. They all cast magic missile. That'll be 20 D4 plus 20 damage. That's hilarious and terribly unfair, but maybe justified sometimes. Anyway, it's neither here nor there, I suppose. But in World of Darkness, there's kind of 3 different main classifications for backgrounds to buy that are tied to the mortal world, right? So there's contacts, influence, and allies. So contacts aren't necessarily dedicated, but they're just sources of information. So they're not going to go do things for you, but they are sources of information, right?
By the same token, they're not going to require favors from you.
Right. And then allies is actual people, like an individual generally that that will do things for you. And they may also ask for favors in return. So whatever it might be, if you ask them to...
This is Hannibal Lecter and Claire. What is her name? Clarice. That's
Clarice,
it.
yeah.
Clarice and Hannibal Lecter. He's an ally. So I think it's a good illustration because he's not necessarily somebody that you
I see
agree
where you're
with on things, but it is somebody that you can use to call in a favor. So you guys don't have to see eye to eye. You don't have to be on the same political spectrum. You don't have to be on the same good and evil spectrum.
Right.
But it's a favor for many things.
Right on. That's a really cool example of two people that are pretty far apart that you could, would be allies, I suppose. That's what that background would, where he would
Doesn't
fall.
he only ever give her information, though?
Yes, but that's all she ever really asks for,
But
too. Although
It's
I think
also
there's a
highly specialized information, and because he's a doctor, I mean, it's a very credible.
well, he's a doctor and he's a serial killer. I mean,
I wouldn't
it's
say,
very niche specific.
yeah. Context is more generally, in my view of things, is just something more broad. It's just like I have, like Varys in Game of Thrones, right? He has loads of contacts. So they're spread all over the place, but they're not necessarily specific people. It's more broad information stuff. Whereas I think Hannibal, in my mind, would, in that example, I think he would fall into the ally category, because while she goes to him to ask him for things, and he kind of sends her on errands to do things for him or whatever, for his own twisted reasons or what.
And it's not just information either. She asks him basically to build a profile of the killer that she's
Right.
looking for.
Exactly. So yeah, right on. That's a cool example. I hadn't even considered that. So
Plus, it's a specific person. Your contacts are
yeah, just
Vague.
generalized. Yeah. And I think they're left intentionally vague, which is cool in their own way, because, well, I guess we'll just talk about context real quick, because we're kind of dabbling in this, and I think it'll be one of the faster ones. We just kind of glazed over it. But contacts are cool in that it is very broad, and you don't have to declare individuals or areas for what they are.
they're like the dot to dot representation of I know people.
Right. What I like about them, though, is from the game master storyteller side of things, I don't have to come up with a reason to give you information. If you have contacts, I just say, well, your contacts give you this. There doesn't have to be any hand waving that happens. It's an easy thing to deliver simple bits of information that are plot relevant without having to have some artificial meaning for why someone would come find you or whatever it is. I can just say, here you go. This week, your contacts give you X information.
Yeah.
Is there anything else relevant about contacts, you think, or does that pretty much cover it? I mean, it's very basic. I mean, I think it might have one paragraph in the book.
I think that sounds pretty good.
Okay.
I'm just trying to think of a good illustration of what the difference is. I feel like if you nail it down, like Game of Thrones has some good examples, but I can't think of a specific character. So like Varys is the Master of Whispers or whatever, Lord of Whispers. And so he has his little birds. Those
Right.
would be like his contacts. But then he also has specific people that he gets information from or gets favors from. And those would be like his allies. I'm just not being able to think of a specific person at the moment that he uses.
In the books, doesn't Littlefinger... Wouldn't Shatea be like an ally to Littlefinger, and she has all the whores for contacts?
Yeah, I think that could probably be an accurate statement.
Sometimes it's kind of hard to shoehorn things from books and stuff into, like when you're trying to delineate between an ally or a contact, sometimes it's a little hard because as the story develops, sometimes characters get a little more important or they serve a bigger plot point. So it's like, I guess if they're a bigger part of the storyline and part of the plot, then they move into the ally category. If they're not, if they're just some random source or whatever, and they may have a name, but if they're not plot relevant, I don't think that makes them into an ally category.
Right.
Or if the other thing would be is if they're so
The level of power is different too.
Well, I think if it would be reasonable for them to ask for something back from you, then it makes them an ally. So it's like one of the sparrows in the case of Varys, right? It wouldn't make any sense in the storyline for them to ask something back of him, right? Because most of them are just like street urchins and that kind of stuff, But if they're in a position to ask for something more, than like a crust of bread or whatever, because they're starving and they're street urchins, then I think it puts them into the category of ally.
Okay.
Is that fair to say, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay. So now I guess we're going to get into the real meat and potatoes of this, which is where my favorite part is. And some of these things we're going to talk about come from the Mind's Eye Theater side of things, because in Mind's Eye Theater, they break the influence up into very clear categories. And I always imported that into my tabletop games because I think it made the influence a little more tangible and a little less abstracted. Did you guys feel that way in the games? Because
I thought in tabletop it's less specific, but you still have to break your influence up into categories.
you do, but I always liked the idea of having the categories set out because I felt like it made it a little more clear for what you could expect and what you were going to use them for.
Yeah, it also makes it easier for newer players too. So if you're looking at this and you're like, oh my influence could be anything, okay.
Yeah.
Like it's always easier just to add some categories and kind of narrow it down for people.
Mm-hmm. So in Mind's Eye Theater, they break the influence down into several different categories, and I believe there's 14 of them, but we're not going to go through all 14 of them because I think that'll be a little exhaustive and kind of droning on. But I do think that maybe if we each pick a couple of our favorites and then talk about what you have used for them to do in the past or what you thought you might use them to do in other game situations and whatever to make that, to drive home that death by pitchfork. Because one of the most fun things to do is, in my mind, to take a much weaker character in terms of experience points that have been spent and bought, or in terms of age, if you're looking at vampires, right? And use their influence and position in the mortal world to really put the hurting on an older vampire, a more established vampire, because, like I said, you can't fight that mob. Do you know what I mean? And I guess it's a more interesting way to attack people as opposed to just trying to smash their face in or blow up their car or gun them down with a machine gun.
Right.
So, right on. So, do you guys just want to?
Yeah. Who wants to start?
My favorite is the church influence, because you got the big heavy hammer with the church influence is always the Inquisition. At least in Dark Ages, it's the Inquisition. It could be something similar in a more recent timeline, but.
Well, I mean, you're not exactly like lighting people on fire. Although, I mean, you could side with the Westboro Baptist Church, I suppose.
See?
But.
Well, they still have access. The Inquisition still exists in modern times, and they also have access to hunters that are somehow connected to the church, but maybe not all the way in the Inquisition.
But that's just the hammer to the church influence. You can also have a church hold a get together that a big name local politician is at, and just smear him while he's there. Or have one of your allies smear him. Like if he's not very bright, he's just really likable. That's not so hard to do.
Right.
You could old people in churches, they have lots of the monies, right? So you could totally put the squeeze on one of them to fund a new dot in say industry influence.
Right.
As you get them to give you money to start up new businesses and stuff.
Churches of Funworks is kind of diverse. You can kind of weasel your way into a lot of other areas because a lot of people go to church, which is a lot of different kind of people. So it's across a broad spectrum of things. I suppose.
But every politician does it.
Well, yeah, of course. So right on. Lacey?
My favorite area of influence is health, because there are so many applications for that people don't really consider. So first of all, disease outbreaks are always going to be a big thing in Vampire because that impacts the food supply. So when you're talking about knowledge about those things, how they're spreading, that's an area of health influence. Being able to obtain blood from your local blood bank, that's health influence. Being able to bail your friend out of the morgue, that's health influence. Being able to make a dead body disappear in a way that isn't suspicious, that's health influence.
Right on. At the same time, you can reverse all that as well, in that there are unexplained deaths now. Oh, wait a second. This person died in your feeding grounds.
Yeah, if you definitely want a death to be looked into, that's also health influence.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of ways to point authorities at enemies.
And God forbid you get enough health influence to be able to actually quarantine an area. The madness that could ensue from that is just mind-boggling. Yeah.
So that's I don't know. That's relevant because of, I guess, our just personal experiences and professional lives or whatever, but there is potentially has very big impacts in ways that a lot of people wouldn't normally suspect. So I'm going to go with my favorite one in LARP, and this is I ran lots of Mind's Eye Theater games, some for several years, and my favorite sort of unsung hero of all of them was always bureaucracy.
Oh my gosh, that was going to be my second one.
Sorry, I stole it.
I just think about the Vogons from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? And so, you're not filing the paperwork involved the decimation of an entire planet.
Right. So my favorite thing about it was that it's everywhere. It goes everywhere. Everything requires a permit to do something. All these little things. So, if you were in the know for what someone else wants to do, I'm looking at this from trying to be more be obstructive to someone and stop them from doing things. So, Lee, you mentioned you want to have your little church rally, right? oh, well, you got denied the permit to have this thing happen. It could be something as simple as that. And while sometimes it's more fun to just be an absolute nuisance to someone for no reason, they're your enemy, going to be a thorn in your side. I'm not actually going to do anything that would, really.
That's actually my goal in most long-term LARPs now, is to pick someone to just pick on. because sometimes I go to LARPs and I don't know anyone
have
else,
anything to do.
so.
Right. So the other thing is it involves any kind of code stuff. So if your fence is built too close to the property line at a haven, that's got to come down. Hey, this is a public building that you have. Well, we're going to have a fire inspection now. We're going to shut your business down, or health code, or any other code violation that you can imagine. Because everybody knows of a local restaurant in town, right, that got shut down because they had some code violation, right? Every town has those.
All of them at one point.
Right. So but all that stuff. So if a person has any kind of dealings with anything, a restaurant, an art gallery, a business of any kind, a business building, a bank. Hey, this section here is not up to code. It's not safe for people to be inside this building, so you can't have customers in here anymore. We're going to shut this building down until this is taken care of. It's just so broad and far-reaching in kind of a, I don't even know, such a small way, because I saw it happen in
there's a really good death and taxes joke in here somewhere.
It's exactly it. But I saw, just as an example, right? So Lacey, you have this bureaucracy influence, right? And you're going to take an action against Lee's character because Lee has dealings at this bank or whatever, right? And so you send your building inspectors in there to declare that whatever, the bank vault doesn't meet the code for ventilation. There's not enough ventilation in there, right? So we have to shut this whole thing down, right?
How dare you not ventilate your vaults, sir?
Right.
You better hope your firefighters don't ever need to get paid again.
But my favorite thing is that I get to go deliver this message to them, and half the time they would have no idea that it was someone doing something to them because it was just so completely kind of innocuous. Do you know what I mean? It just was why is this happening to me? I don't understand what the purpose of the plot is for this, right? So then oftentimes it can just keep growing and developing. Okay, well, the inspectors came in, you're shut down because of this. Okay, well, now they've got to come back in and re-inspect, right? So then they've got to do it again and over and over and over. And you can really in a long-term kind of play situation, you can kind of cut down on the resources of their influence. And what's nice about it is it goes everywhere. So if you're starting to think 1 and 2 steps ahead, if you know that you want to accomplish something, but someone is going to stand in your way, you can cut down their influence and ability to do things against you to try and stop you by knocking out what they would use to oppose you. Does that make sense, or is that too vague?
It was a little vague.
Huh?
I mean, I got it, but I think it's
okay. Well, let's just give an example then. So,
yay, examples. So perhaps I have high society influence, and that's something that I want to grow. And I plan on doing that because, high society people are supposed to have money and do fancy things. So I'm going to open a private dinner club for all of my high society friends. And by doing that, that would grow my amount of influence because now I have this extra thing that I'm adding on. And so you're going to use your bureaucracy influence to block the zoning of that building in order for me to be able to open my private supper club.
Exactly. I guess that's exactly. I mean, that's, pretty much exactly what we're talking about, right? Stopping that kind of things from happening. The other thing is I've had buildings that were declared had to be demoed because they were structurally unsound. Now, whether they actually were or not was up to debate. But when you hold the keys to the inspection codes, it's pretty easy to say, nope, this thing is no good and has to be torn down. I saw several havens that were declared condemned, and, they had to be torn down. I saw a person who like to go have surprise fire inspections done on certain public or commercial industrial buildings. And lo and behold, wait a second, there's a dead guy in here, which is actually a sleeping vampire. And the mayhem that ensues from finding a dead guy in a random commercial office building, in the case of a Brewha or a Venture, right? And all the trouble and drama that ensues from that. And then you're talking about the health influence, kind of starts to pull everything together.
I like the media influence because people do still read local papers. And if you put a story on the front page that says how this business was shut down for not being up to code, people are going to pay a lot more attention than if it's just shut down for code and there's no news story about it.
Right.
It makes problems go away.
How so?
If people don't know, they don't care. And if a big stink is not made out of it, then nobody knows.
Mm-hmm. Right. I do know that I saw media influence used a lot to help cover up breaches of the, or minor breaches of the masquerade and that kind of stuff, or to not shed light on, like in the dead body example, right?
Oh, that wasn't vampires in the streets. That was a university flash mob.
right. Exactly.
What?
Yeah. So it's an easy one, especially now there's media everywhere, but I almost think in a way it's becoming more, or I guess less and less relevant. Because
it's just becoming different now. There's not like major corporations. Everybody's doing it.
Right. But that's what I'm saying. Like, I think that would be harder to manage in terms of an influence because
they still generally tend to get together in sort of collectives, though.
Yeah. But I think I guess what I'm trying to say is even if you have
spontaneous order, woot.
Even if you have control over like a local news station or a local newspaper, right? Everybody has a camera in their pocket. So in terms of trying to say something didn't happen in the case of like a masquerade issue or some other thing, right? It's really hard to just be like, oh, no, that didn't happen. Well, there's all these YouTube videos or whatever it is, right? Floating around. I think it's as time changes, assuming that you're in like a modern, like a present day game, I think it's becoming harder to manage that, I guess, in a way.
Big news. Gary Lytle. He's crazy.
Who's Gary Lytle?
He's random guy A that said the news got it wrong.
Right, I got you.
With his homemade camera.
You said Gary Lytle like I was supposed to know who he was or whatever. So
that was just a name I picked out of my...
Right on, dude. Right on. I like it. It's going to be my newest NPC name, Gary Lytle. Cameraman, Gary Lytle.
I was trying to come up with generic names, and I almost said Gary Johnson.
It is pretty generic. Johnson.
All right, Lacey, what about you? Number 2?
I am going to have to give it to good old-fashioned street influence. You can get a lot done with that. You can get into plenty of trouble with it, and you can get out of plenty of trouble with it. It's basically like having a gang of ruffians at your disposal. It's also a good way to get petty cash, because where there's petty crime, there's petty cash. Now, this isn't like the big things of underworld influence, like organized crime. So this is just, your back alley hookers and crack dealers. This is the good people of the streets.
Right.
But if you're wanting to get small arms, like I said, petty cash, small amounts of drugs or drug paraphernalia, this is the route that you're going to go. It's also good for if you're wanting somebody to maybe deface a building or other small crimes, minor larceny and arson, things like that. You could use your streetwise influence for. And it's also a good way outside of contacts to get information. So your folks on the street see a lot of things and hear a lot of rumors, and this is a good place to pick up that information.
Or spread that information.
Yes, it's also a great way to spread rumors that aren't true.
Exactly. Right on.
Or that are true. Whatever.
Well, the street is kind of like bureaucracy in a slightly similar way in that it goes everywhere.
Right.
It's
really... there's a reason the word on the street is in existence.
Right. Even in Sesame Street.
That's right.
So.
Yay, Murray. There used to be Telemonster, but see, that was more like media influence. Murray is more like street. Oh, you have to pick another one. There's a lot of good ones.
Well, I know there's some easy gimmies, like police is obviously an easy one. Right. When you control law enforcement and are able to do search and seizure stuff. And, it makes things that's an easy, gimme for a lot of stuff. But I don't want to, that one seems like it's a little too easy. You know what I mean?
Right. People are pretty much aware of the shenanigans you can get into with police officers.
Right. High society is another one that's kind of easy because the people at the top level of everything sort of have their fingers slightly into everything. And I believe, if I remember right, I'm not sure which version of the rules, but with high society, you could take influence actions that were one level lower than what you had. So if you had 5 in high society, it was nice because you sort of had your fingers into everybody, because maybe the president of this company, or maybe the plant manager for this factory, or the university president, or whatever. So you could have your fingers kind of into everything. You were literally had the potential to have influence over any other sphere, I guess. But
pick university.
Well, so actually, I was going to go is university is a good one because depending on the city you're playing in, if you have a large university, there's all kinds of research that's done there. You have access to all kinds of crazy equipment and buildings, students for sources of food. There's all kinds of things that you can do, but also along with that come with all the student organizations. So if you're trying to attack someone with it, you can use those student organizations as a weapon, by organizing protesters or whatever it is that you want to do.
Latin club for the win.
You can send them against your enemies and rivals or whatever, right? So
Those chess club guys, big rioters.
Look out, they're going to cause all kinds of trouble, right? Plus that if you're looking for any, I don't know, it touches a lot of areas, I suppose. So if you need, anything analyzed, just think of all the different programs that exist at a large university. There's almost everything, they're training doctors, they're training any kind of different scientists that you can imagine, so if you need something studied or analyzed or something covered up, maybe it's a university project.
Well, actually, like hard supplies too.
Yeah.
So maybe I need a crap ton of hydrogen. Well, we happen to have this cool physics lab over here.
Don't mind me. Just making Hindenburg number 2. Right.
There's also an interesting thing for medical school as far as like cadaver labs and things like that go.
That'd be a really cool prank to do to a rival, is to have them wake up on a cadaver lab in an anatomy class or something like that. The nighttime anatomy class. You know what I mean?
I'm pretty sure there's a good Breach of the Masquerade plotline in there somewhere.
That's pretty funny. I might actually use that. It's kind of awesome. Did you guys? Now, you guys both have a fair amount of experience in both LARP and tabletop. Do you feel like that influence actions and that kind of stuff are better suited or more emphasized in one versus the other?
Definitely in LARP. Tabletop tends to happen by the day. We role play a lot. The day, right after the day, right after the day. Whereas in LARP, it's implied you get together once a month or a couple times a month. Right. And then you have 2 weeks to do whatever you want. Now, I'm usually pretty bad about using my own influence actions. I forget about them. But I do think that they're emphasized more in LARP than they are in tabletop.
I disagree entirely.
Really?
Yes. So in LARP, I think it's easy to get caught up doing your things and to forget to use your downtime actions, like you said. Whereas I feel like the influence takes on a different role in the tabletop game. So now it's sort of like a specialized investigative tool. It gets used for that a lot. Calling in resources, knowing the right people, all those fall under influence actions. And I found that I use them probably more in tabletop than I did in LARP.
I'm surprised by that.
By the same token, there are people that can't always be present for a tabletop game that are only present in LARP through their influence actions.
Right, which is
Carrie
really
almost
cool,
did it once.
Which is a really cool aspect of the Mind's Eye Theater LARP, I think. Do you think it's okay to do downtime actions for your tabletop game using influence as well?
I don't know. So I was kind of going to go with this because I know. Well, let's just lay a couple things out because some people may not exactly be familiar with the Mind's Eye Theater system, right? So in most Mind's Eye Theater games, they either have a game that happens, say, once a week, once every 2 weeks, or sometimes even once a month, right? But in terms of when the game time goes by, a lot of times it happens in real time, right? So if we game once a month, the Elysium is once a month, right? And then there's all this time in between the gatherings where you have time to take downtime actions, which usually involve you have 2 personal actions you could take. So those would be like, I'm going to go do this, right? And then you have so many influence actions to take where you get to spend your influence to do things, right?
So real briefly, just touching on the influence actions. So you can spend an action to actually do something. Mm-hmm. You can spend an action to hide the thing that you are doing so that it's not easy to trace that back to you.
Right.
And then you can spend an action to trace down why something happened. Right. So by the same token, and then you can also spend actions to grow your influence and build your influence.
Right, and that's broken down in points, and you spend so many points to do different things or whatever. So we don't want to get too bogged down in that. But do you think in that premise of things, right? Do you think that a tabletop game would be better by using that kind of a mechanic, or do you think it sort of becomes too much to manage and you just want to play your game when you sit down at the table?
Well, there are a lot more people manipulating the strings in a LARP than there are in a tabletop game, which only has 4 or 5 people.
Right.
I think it would be interesting, though. You are going to be asking more of your storyteller, obviously, because now they're going to have to juggle this as well. But it adds a unique level of customization to the game that the players are participating in when you allow them to do these downtime actions. So now you're saying outside of the storyline that I'm specifically giving you and outside of your interaction with these other players, what is it that you individually are wanting to accomplish in this game? And it gives them a little bit of license to do those things. So I think if you're willing to take it on as an ST, I think it could be a really cool mechanism. Plus, if it goes terribly wrong for one of those players, that's something that you can bring into game in a very interesting and fun way as well.
That's true. I think also it's something you kind of miss in a vampire game by not having it. And you see it in LARP because people's influence goes up, it goes down. You have good moments, you have bad moments, right? And that is one of the things they talk about in terms of playing the vampire game, that's because vampires exist outside of time, they can kind of continue to build this influence. It just always continues to build. And I feel like in a tabletop game, you don't get that quite as much because you're more busy running around doing things yourself in a lot of cases, even though it involves vampire society and whatnot, but you're not actually being the behind the scenes manipulator that the game is kind of, I feel like, designed to be in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, and the influence almost adds on a level of social combat that exists in the mortal world. So you have your hierarchy of status and boons and things that sort of go along with the social aspect of the actual vampire world. And now this is like another aspect of social combat that you get to add in that makes certain attributes on your character sheet more important where they might not necessarily be without this system.
Well, you can also actually, you mentioned like social combat, right? You can get involved into a conflict that can be as open or discreet as you want it to be, but isn't necessarily life or death for your character. Right, because death in vampires, the destruction of a vampire is a very big deal, right? And when you're involved in conflicts that involve you as an individual, there's a lot more risk for that potential to happen, to be destroyed. But when you're talking about battling people with influences back and forth, and my influence is attacking your influence, and this kind of stuff, it's a way for vampires to compete against one another, but in a much safer, hands-off kind of a way.
It's like a game. It's like vampires playing a game of chess.
Exactly. Yeah. Right on. So I don't really know how to draw this one to a close, and I'm not sure that there is.
How about more non-World of Darkness death by pitchforks?
Okay.
Like zombies.
Zombie doesn't strike me as death by pitchfork because...
What's this sort of same overrun by the mob feeling, except to add cannibalism?
But I feel like...
I think
the reason it's not is because in that case you're not in a giant, huge, powerful monster. You're just a guy getting eaten by a horde of zombies, right? Whereas in like Death by Pitchfork, you're the Frankenstein or you're the Count Dracula. You're some powerful
guy with a functioning brain,
but you're not indestructible. You're still just as fragile as any other human. Whereas Frankenstein is not as fragile as a human, right? He literally tears people in half or whatever, So I don't feel like that's the same exact comparison. I guess it's death by a mob, but not quite the...
I think there's probably some interesting implications for that same feeling in like a Space 1889 game where you have some of that. It's sort of similar to the Frankenstein thing. You have science operating outside the moral code of surrounding society. And anytime you have that, then you create the opening for the whole death by pitchfork scenario.
Yeah.
Supreme scientists,
Yeah. I suppose if you have if you're creating some kind of Ubermensch or something, some
monstrumologist.
Yeah, exactly.
Character.
But I think that's the whole crux of it is it has to be a thing that is normally invulnerable in a lot of ways and takes this literally mob of people to come down and
well, really, in that case, you're always going to be looking at either science to the degree that it looks like magic or some form of magic.
Yeah.
Be that vampires or, wizardy magic or what have you, but science or magic.
Although I suppose it would be very hard to have.
Science is magic.
I think it would be hard to have death by pitchfork against a 20th level wizard because, I mean,
Fireball
is very Wow.
Depends on how spread out your first level wizards are.
There you go. I suppose you're right. So
Scatter spray. You're gonna need to pull out your what do they call those things you lay on top of them?
templates.
Yeah, your template.
I do like the idea of death by bottle rocket. That's my that's pretty awesome. So, all right, right on.
I think I have one more question
What's
for
that?
this topic. Do you see any applications for this in other games outside of World of Darkness? Which I think we kind of touched on with the death by pitchfork scenario, but just the use of influence in general. Are there other places that
Conspiracy
you can use
X
those
addresses it right away because it actually has influence on your character sheet.
Yeah, spheres of influence is in that system, right?
Yeah, in Conspiracy X, you are part of a group called Aegis that is dealing with X-Files style stuff, but you have a normal day job in some kind of government agency, whether that's NSA or CIA, FBI, DEA, whatever three-letter organization you work for. And in those cases, you get to bring their resources to bear. So if you work for the CDC, one of the actions you can take is you can use the CDC authority to drop down a quarantine on an area. There's access to laboratory equipment if you work for the FBI or the CIA for forensic stuff. So, and those ones it very directly does, but maybe the forensic stuff isn't the best example because that's not you doing it to someone else. It's using it for information. I guess the CDC one is probably the best example of that, but it's definitely present in that. It's not really addressed, I think, very well, and I'm not sure it's a fault of it, but in like D&D, it's just not a thing. You just generally don't, that's not part of the mindset of the D&D game. Do you know what I mean?
Do you think you could bring this into this system somehow?
I think you could if you focus more on being like some kind of a ruler or where you are in charge of a guild or something like that, and that could become relevant in that in terms of that.
Like Birthright?
Yeah, I would say in Birthright it would be relevant, but
you see this in sort of your Fate genre games too. So if you're running like Fate of Freeport, your rapport attribute sort of brings this in a little bit.
Is that a stunt?
No,
It's a skill.
It's a skill. Sorry, I said attribute. Your rapport skill sort of brings it in.
Oh, no. Fate of Freeport uses the approaches, but yeah, I see what you're saying.
In a general Fate game. Then,
in any Fate core game, yeah. You could use rapport, or you could use, I think contacts is on there as well. So it would be totally, relevant, same thing. And in Fate, you could use it as part of your aspects too. If my aspect is that I'm a Baltimore police officer, right? Automatically that assumes that, if it says I'm a Baltimore police sergeant, maybe, right? So I have some influence over the patrols on my shift or whatever. So that would imply that, I guess.
You could also create a social stress tracker.
Yeah.
In addition to your mental or physical, or in substitution for one or the other.
Yeah, no, that's one that actually exists in several different games. So
there's also Burning Wheel and the mouse guard system both have circles and specific relationships that you build.
Mm-hmm. So circles would be, this is a circle of people that I know, that would be like blacksmiths or soldiers or something along those lines. It encompasses a group of people.
That's almost more like your contact skill. But there are specific relationships that you build at pluses and minuses
new
as well.
relationships from using your circles.
Mm-hmm.
So like you go out to find information and you meet this guy, and this guy you get the information from is now also an ally in a way.
It builds on itself. It's kind of a cool way to structure it, but yeah.
Do you think of any other systems that, obviously the Song of Ice and Fire one is probably a pretty obvious one when it comes to social engagement. We mentioned it.
I guess there's a lot of them that do. I don't know if the new Shadowrun does, but the old one used to be able to buy contacts and you could specify what they were, but they were people that you knew in different areas of influence, I guess, and you could use them for information or to do things for you.
I think the White Wolf system is unique in how it breaks it down to such a degree, though. So it almost puts more emphasis on it because you're not just talking about getting information and calling in favors. Now it's broken down into several different categories and specific areas that you're using to do things, and it almost encourages more meddling than you would get with the other systems that use similar social.
Right. Well, I think it's part of that meddling is the right word, because I think it's part of the world, part of the themes of the vampire world and whatever. So I think it's a bigger piece of it because it's kind of part of the expectation, whereas with D&D games, like your regular old fantasy game, it's just not part of it. Even in the bigger ones, like Lord of the Rings type scenario, there's just not a lot of influence that's happening, in that, other than gathering armies. It's just not part of that world, I guess.
So I have a question. In this game of vampire chess, how do you know who to team up with to take somebody down?
I don't think you do. You don't really know. You just know what the end goal is, and then you sort of hope for the best in choosing your allies.
Generally, for me, I would try and find the person that they have something that I want, or they've done something to me, and then I look at who is already competing with them, who is already their enemy, and then I buddy up to them, and then try to put them into a position where they will be the one caught, not me. That was generally my go-to plan. And to make it more like, oh, I kind of don't like them. I know you really don't, though, and I guess I can kind of help you if you need some help along the way to, to kind of slow play it a little bit.
But like all kinds of people come into games sometimes in coteries.
Yeah, but all coteries fail.
Oh, okay.
That's just a fact. Eventually they all fail. There's only been one that I saw that didn't fail in all of the games that I have ran and been part of. There's only one that I saw that didn't fail, and that was Crispy, Daryl, and Jason. But they had a secret coterie of elders that worked together to try and better the city, and publicly they were rivals and even enemies, but behind the scenes they were thick as thieves, I suppose you might say, and they did a very good job and worked very hard to make sure that it was put out there that way. But
it was very well done.
Yeah, I was surprised. It was very hard for me to keep the secret about it because they did a very good job. I thought eventually it would fail, but
I'm pretty sure I played in that game.
Yeah, it was a very good game.
Guessed it.
Now it almost, there were a couple.
I played the main antagonist in that game.
There were a couple of moments where it was tense and the relationships were not as strong as they were at one point, but it never actually failed. Eventually, amends were made, and and that was one out of every game that I've ever been part of that I saw that didn't eventually fall apart.
Did each one of those know what their other person had influence in?
Yeah, they were very open coterie. They weren't completely open, but they, more open than most, I guess would be the best way to put it. But they were very definitely working together to raise their power in the city, but not openly have it, if that makes sense. They wanted to kind of be the power behind the prince in a way, but they actually were staging. This is a good example of, without going too deep into gaming story, but they were staging problems with their influence that they knew about that they could solve. So they were stacking the deck, so to speak, nice. So that they would find out who is weak in these areas of influence in the city. We can fix these problems. We will create problems that can only be fixed with this specific influence that we have control over. And they reaped a lot of reward and boon by doing that. So right on. This is an awful long gaming story, I guess, to just display, I guess, what you can do with influence or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have anything more to say about influence?
No, I don't think so. I feel like we got a good base coverage there.
Right on. All right. Well, as always, you can find us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix, or you can find us online at JustOneMoreFix.com. You can also support us by going to iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play, wherever it is that you find our podcast, and give us a rating and a comment. And other than that, I guess we will see you guys next week. Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at Incompetech.com. You can support us at Patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix, or follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.